other side of Shovel Shop Pond. And Oliver Ames came over here in 1803 and started to make shovels, probably pretty much the same way his father made shovels, which was the blacksmith way, one at a time with one person working on one shovel, maybe getting some help from somebody who knew a little bit more about woodworking to make the handles. But that wasn't a way to make a lot of money making shovels, so very, very quickly he began to subdivide the process into steps that semi-skilled workers could get involved in. And between 1803 and 1836, the shovel making process got broken down into about 20 different steps that were taken care of by 20 different individuals. Then on March 2nd, 1852, the original shovel company burned to the ground over there. Most of the buildings were made out of wood. I think one or two were stone at that time. And it all occurred because Patrick Quinn, the night watchman, whose house is over on 92 Elm Street, dropped a lantern into a vat of varnish and set the whole place on fire. The Ameses apparently weren't too upset with that because Pat Quinn continued to work for the shovel company for the rest of his life until he retired. They did have insurance, but from what we can tell, the losses from that fire were about $40,000, and they had about $3,000 in insurance, so it didn't pay off. But they did decide to move back over here to land that Oliver Ames had bought many, many years before, and had set up a small textile mill with a man named Daniel Manley over on the little Queesit Brook. That's the start of our story. Now, we're going to be looking at a lot of buildings, and there's been a lot of work that's been done, so there's the new story and the old story to talk about. But the old story is harder to talk about than you might think, because the names of the buildings I'm going to tell you really don't come from much earlier than the turn of the 20th century. Somebody developed an insurance map at that time and named all the buildings. That doesn't necessarily mean that the buildings were actually used for what it says they were back in 1902. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute as well. The other thing is that in 1928, the company wasn't making any money. In fact, they probably weren't making much money here in 1902 either. They had factories in other parts of the country that were much better located to natural resources. But in 1928, they brought in Stone and Webster to redesign the shovel making process. You'll hear a lot about the assembly line idea here in Easton, and there's a beginning point, and Stone and Webster 1928 thing is really when it really got going, and we'll see that. But they rearranged the use of all the buildings. So there's a lot to talk about, and we need to get moving. I'm going to try to use this speaker system, and we're going to be heading in that direction. So give me a chance to grab it, and we'll be on the move. What happened as soon as the factory burned down, old Oliver hired as many carpenters as he could find. They say that all the carpenters for about 20 miles around were hired to create temporary factories, or temporary factory, which is a big long shed of a building. And they were back in operation, according to the diary of Oakes Ames's wife, within just a few weeks. So they didn't lose a lot of money because of the fire. The building was being constructed to replace those temporary housing over here, and that's the Long Shop, which is this building right here. The Long Shop is 530 feet long, and it once upon a time housed the entire shovel making process. Now, making shovels is a complicated process, which I probably won't explain very well, but there were dozens of different varieties of shovels. You know, snow shovels, coal shovels, shovels that you could use to clear drains, all sorts. But there were basically three categories. One was an iron shovel with a steel edge. That was the cheapest shovel. One was a cast steel shovel that had its iron straps riveted on. And then the most expensive shovel was the Antrim process shovel, which was a steel blade with cast iron welded on. And the welding process was this Antrim process. In 1853, the feeling that I get is that the only shovels that were really being made here were the cheapest ones, the ones that had an iron blade and a steel edge. And basically, all you had to do was take a piece of iron, fold it over onto a steel blade, and hammer it a lot, and you had a shovel. That's the simple version. The complicated version required a lot more preparation with very, very heavy power requirements. Now, you've probably heard the story here in Easton, if you've been around long enough, that the Ameses came over here and they switched over to steam power. And that's sort of true. In 1853, they powered part of the long shop with a 60 horsepower steam engine. But it was the 20th century before the last water wheel stopped being used to provide power on the site. And we'll actually see that water wheel when we get around to the other side. So originally what happened is that handles and small pieces of iron that were about 3 inches wide and maybe 16 inches long came in one end of this building, were hammered into a basic shape, folded over, and then with more hammering with smaller shovels, smaller hammers, turned into a typical shovel blade. Does everyone know the difference between a shovel and a spade? Okay. So they made both shovels and spades here, but they didn't necessarily distinguish when they counted up shovels. We live in Easton. No one counted up shovels. They counted up dozens of shovels. So the unit of measure is dozens. And by the 1860s, we were making about 70,000 dozen shovels a year here at this site. The basics of the assembly line is here. You know, you start at one end of this building with raw materials and finished goods walked out the other end. But refinements could be made, and so buildings were added on step by step. One of the ones that was added on somewhat later was right in back of us over here, and this is the handle shop. It was created in 1866, and once upon a time it had railroad tracks on both sides of it instead of just one side of it. And raw materials from Maine and Michigan could be taken out and turned into handles. It paid to have this in a separate building because in order to cure the wood, you had to heat at least part of the building up to 110 degrees so that the wood would dry, and then you'd have to use moist heat to get it wet to put in the famous Ames bend. And the famous Ames bend was an idea that was actually invented here to put a bend in the shovel handle so that it was more ergonomic to use. Oliver Ames's shovels were lighter than British imported shovels, and the idea here was that in England you had a vast labor supply, so if a guy got tired using a shovel, you just have another poor worker come along and pick it up and continue on. Here in the United States, less labor, so you didn't want to wear your worker out, you want to wear your shovel out, so a lighter shovel proved to be best for here. All right. In 1855, the railroad came through here, and that began to change everything, and the buildings began to expand rather quickly. So let's start our real walk by going down the lane here. Well, we came down this way instead of going through the pretty green area, and it's just I kind of want to emphasize the pretty green area when we get there, but the landscaping is a big part of the new shovel works. The person who pitched it to the Historical Commission said it could be an award-winning landscape because it's different from the landscapes that we're used to. It's not an Olmsted curvy landscape. It's very, very jagged and diagonal. And we're taking some chances with it. So what we're standing on right now is essentially what used to be a railroad siding. And you can tell the buildings that had railroad sidings next to them because most of them have doors on the second floor, which you notice don't have stairways coming off them. And the reason for this was that ramps would be put out and materials could be brought in or out into the trains. And there was a train track on either side of this building as well. This is the storehouse. It was built in 1870, and raw materials came in one side of this building and finished shovels went out on the other side. And there was a connecting catwalk area that connected this back up with the long shop. So that, that was what it was initially used for. In 1937, when the whole process of making shovels was revolutionized by Stone and Webster, this became the handle shop, and the original handle shop across the street became a storage area. And what that meant was that when it says storage area, apparently a lot of the storage space was actually rented out to other companies, just as we all remember it from the Tolfius era in the 1970s. Notice how this goes downhill here, and the reason it goes downhill is that you could back up your freight car, unhitch the freight cars, and just let them slide down until they ran into a bumper down here. So this area down here was where the coal was kept. One of the things that we're kind of debating, we don't really know about yet, is when they started to use what's called a yard engine, which is a small steam engine that could pull cars up and down the sidings around here. The roundhouse that was across next to the handle shop was only put in 1904, and some people argue that up until 1904, they just used oxen to move things around on the site. Now, we're about to turn the corner, and I hope you get the same feeling about this place when we get around the corner as I did the last couple of times I've done it. It's pretty amazing. There's a lot going on here, both old and new. I'm just kind of overwhelmed at the scale of how just big this place is. We're talking about three and a half story buildings, but they're big. Unlike the parking lot side by the railroad station, I feel a little dwarfed in here. Once upon a time, there were about 500 workers on site making shovels. You can see that the old storage building has dormers that have been added. That's new. There weren't dormers here. There were some skylight ventilation areas in some of these buildings. We also have the cupolas added back on a number of the buildings, although at once upon a time there were 16 cupolas, and now there are 6, is that right? 6? 6. We thought we were going to get 7, but we ended up with 6. So those are original features that are brought back. This is a real good spot to take a look up the way between the long shop and the storage area and see what they did with the landscaping. They're using rocks because this is an industrial site and they want to kind of remind you of that. And the paths are zigzags. If you're an art history major, zigzags, diagonals are energetic and all of that sort of stuff, and sort of symbolize the activity that once took place here, unlike gently curving lines that were the original idea. Now, once we get down here, things begin to get complicated. In 1852, this building was completed. You can see it up there in the eaves. It says 1852. And this smaller addition that you see next to it was also put in place at the same time. That little L right over here was the machine shop, where most of the heavy-duty hammers and things were repaired, and edges were put on blades and all sorts of things there. The machinery proved to be so complicated and important that within 5 years, that huge addition that you see was added on, and that too became the machine shop. So it was gigantic, and it had a water power system running underneath it. The 1857 building and the little addition here in 1937 became the assembly area. So what happened was that handles were made over here, blades were made in the shop that we'll see around the corner that's now going to be the garage, and they both came together in this building and were assembled. It's an assembly line, just like at the Ford Motor Company. Other buildings on site here represent the fact that the process of making shovels got more complicated. In 1853, just a year after this building was opened, this building over here was added. And this is the steam hammer shop. This was the second steam engine that was put in. There's a small building on the other side where the steam engine was. And the big heavy hammers that were once in the long shop were moved over here, which probably cut down substantially on the noise in here. Why have everybody in your factory deaf? So the process began to be subdivided even more. By 1856, instead of having 20 steps in the shovel making process, there were 50. Okay, and most of the processes started in this building to make the blades. In back over here, you have what's called the new plate polishing shop. It's new. It was created in 1880, and that's because the old plate polishing shop is attached to the back of the steam hammer shop. Plate polishing has to do with making of these steel shovels. Basically, a plate came in of the right size and thickness, and you had to polish it up to get rid of the scale that was on it for making the steel before it could go and be hammered in one pretty simple process into a shovel blade. Making shovels the old-fashioned way by folding it over meant that you had to weld pieces together and do a lot to the blade. There were more steps in the cheapest of the shovel blades than there were in the more expensive ones, strangely enough. But the process begins to be subdivided. The old process stayed over here. Steel shovels started to be made over here. So you have division of labor. We're going to head this way, I think.
And why were they zigzag again?
To show dramatic and energetic lines.
I like that.
Yeah.
Dramatic.
Well, originally the steam hammer shop was 2 stories made of stone, like all the major buildings on site. But the second story was destroyed in a fire at a point that we're still kind of researching. I've heard the date 1889, which is about 30 years after it was built, and then it got a flat roof. But I was looking at some pictures before we came over here, and that might be a little bit too early. At any rate, for the longest time, this building had one flat roof, and as part of the project to put in a reasonable number of apartments to pay for the project, the second story was restored. And instead of going with stone, they went with stucco, which is sort of cement applied over a wooden framework. I helped to pick the color here. Isn't that a wonderful color? It was was light kind of smushy and medium kind of smushy and dark smushy, and we got the medium. We actually opted for the dark smushy, and then the guy said, I don't know, I think we'll go with the medium instead. So we compromised.
Did they put the bell back there?
No, the bell is not there. We'll see the bell later on the tour. We may even be able to ring it, although we'd be taking a chance. The bell is not going to go back in the cupola. The bell, like several other things that were found on site, are going to be part of a display that y'all can come and take a look at. And we'll see that once we go around the corner. Okay, we're lucky to have a local historian of some repute here, Paul Berry. And Paul happened to be here when the steam handle shop burned. It was February of 1960. So it was much more recent. I wasn't quite here yet. I didn't come to Easton until 1961. We're in an area, some of you are standing right in the middle of a future sidewalk here. And the sidewalk comes up and then zigzags back to the street. And the reason for that is that this is going to be a display area. And when we were, I didn't do any of this work, when they were creating the shovel works, they discovered that the company maintained a drainage ditch system that once provided water power as a way of running their fire piping through the system. So a water wheel was actually left in place, and the water wheel was discovered, and if we walk carefully behind this machine, we can take a look at it. So this is the one remaining water wheel. This is the cam that would connect it to other wheels to translate the power. And this is where the wooden wheel with the buckets would have come out. So this is going to get cleaned off, and a coating's going to be put onto it that will allow it to stay outside. And I suggested we put it out this way, but they wanted to turn it on its side so you can actually see how it used to work. So some of the granite that you see here is the support work that they'll be laying this down on. Now in back of you, as you turn around and look at the bulkhead door there are a pile of things right where Mr. Mullen is standing. And those are dies that were used in the process of hammering out the steel blades. So you'd put your steel blade, your steel plate on that, and a huge hammer would come down, and the top would have one die in it, and the bottom would have another, and it would smush it to make that shape. Then all you had to do would be to trim the edges with giant shears, which were essentially just scissors that were large enough to cut steel, if you can imagine. We couldn't find any of those on site, but they were very, very large and run by steam power. In back of you, I should point out the little house across the street was not a little house. That is actually the Antrim hammer shop. And the Antrim process was a way of making shovels with welded blades that were left, that were welded onto a steel shovel. And every time a shovel was trimmed up, scraps would be left, which were sent over to Canton to be melted down and brought back to make the shovel straps that would go onto the handles. That place also used to include a blacksmith shop, which is the low building next to it, and then finally a engine shop as well to run a steam engine. However, it's the only house in town that actually has a glass partition in the floor of its living room to show where the water wheel came through. There, a little brook runs underneath, and a water wheel used to be there. The house in back of you, we've been calling the Millie Packard house. It's actually a little more complicated than that. When we initially started working on the site here, Millie Packard, a widow woman, owned this house in the 1840s, and everybody said, oh, Millie Packard, 1840s, that's when the house was built. Unfortunately, that's not true. The house is actually about 20 years older. It was built by Millie's husband, a man named Tilson Packard, so it's actually the Millie and Tilly Packard house. The color choice in the earliest picture we have was unpainted shingles and dark trim, and I'm kind of waiting to see the dark trim. Some other folks are waiting to see the electrical lines in the front buried. This is going to be a home for our Chamber of Commerce, which will sort of run it as a visitor center, and the other half of the building will be an art gallery, so that we'll have a place to show off the art gallery. If you guys will step up a little bit, you can take a look at the old stable over here. And as I noted before, the Ames is stuck with horsepower and oxen power for a very long time, and the animals were stabled here. This building was put in 1897. There was an earlier barn here, which may or may not have been incorporated in here. It at least burned in part in 1887. When the Stone and Webster people came along in 1928, the stable was converted, at least on the second and third floors, into office space. And the safe that was there, some of you may remember looking in the door and seeing the giant safe. The door of that safe is preserved in the mailroom next to the office, which is a public space. You guys will be able to go in and take a look at this huge door and then walk into the mailroom and see all the mechanisms in the door. The color here caused a lot of concern. At one point there was at least green trim on here, and the Beacon people were considering painting the whole thing a forest green, and the Historical Commission complained, did a little research. There's one color photograph on a postcard of this from around the turn of the last century, and this is pretty close to the color that it was. The detail work up above in brown, it's a little bit harder to prove, but we think that was close to the color as well. And the slate roof is at least partially original. The roof itself has always been slate, but most of the slate on there is original stuff. Okay, we're going to move into the heart of the site. Right here is our new sewage treatment plant. If you don't like your betterment fees, here's your problem right here. Because half the capacity for our new sewage system goes to this area, and then half was available to cause you to pay all those fees. Sorry. We're going to walk around the corner and take a look at the landscaping and some of the other buildings. The building that's going to be the garage was added in 1928. It's the last major building that was put on here, and it was the blade shop. The shovel blades were made in this part of the building, came down into the old machine shop and was assembled. And we'll see how that occurred in a moment. But before we do that, again, three ways of making shovels. The Antrim process was the most expensive shovel. We saw the little Antrim hammer shop over there that created the steel blade. This is what they call the Antrim opening shop here. And this had the job of welding the handle onto the steel blade. And welding iron to steel, I guess, is a difficult process, and that's why it took a special patent in order to do it. And then once this process took place, the handles had holes drilled, the blades had holes, excuse me, let me try that one more time. The straps had holes drilled in them, and then they went and had their handles added on, just like all the other shovels. This little building in back of me, which is going to be a utility building, you can see is made out of concrete blocks. It's made out of nice concrete blocks, but it doesn't fit with the rest of the site, which from 1853 all the way through 1880 was made out of locally quarried stone. This is the next to the last big building put on site. There was one building in the 30s. This is the laboratory, and the idea was that down in Parkersburg, West Virginia, the big Ames shovel company down there had a laboratory where they could do test work, and the Stone and Webster people suggested the same thing for here, and this was put in. So it'll be a utility area. This is a very, very special place. Once upon a time, this building had glass walls that continued all the way down to here. And you can see it also had this trackway that continued into the machine shop. So shovel blades that were finished in here were put on this trackway and slid down into the assembly area. So when Beacon came along, their idea was to show this because it does talk about the history of the site. It shows that eventually an assembly line was established here. And also, the beam system that you see here is the original beams of the glass house. This is the way that it was put together. So they were happy to show that off because it's people use iron girders in a different way now in the 1990s. So they thought that was a nice feature. So this area here obviously is not going to be able to grow trees, so it's a landscape homage to the traditions of the shovel works, and we're trying to have a number of things in here, including the bell. The bell is going to be fixed up, preserved, so that the pitting will slow down, and the entire structure that's supporting it, which used to be up in the cupola up above, is going to be replaced with modern beams to hold it up. They tell me that the workers here are ringing this during the day sometimes. Let me see if I can get this to ring. This will be locked up so that it won't wake the tenants up in the middle of the night when my high school students come through. So don't get any ideas about doing that. The bell used to be the curfew bell. This would ring at 4:50 in the morning to wake everybody up so that they'd be at work by 7 o'clock. Yeah, I know everybody just hops out of bed now, throws something in the toaster and takes a shower, but that's not how you made breakfast in the olden days. The bell rang at noontime because the folks had an hour off for lunch, and then it rang again at 6 o'clock at night. They had a 10-hour day if you were inside workers. If you were an outside worker, you had a dawn to dusk day, like you were a farmer, and that actually caused a work stoppage in the 1850s, and we don't know how it turned out for the outside workers. If you turn around and take a look in back of you, you see some really nice lines and angles. This is a very pretty area in here. The lowest building is what's called the power shop, and that was put in 1906 as part of the electrification of this site. Electricity was only introduced here in 1903. Everything up until that time was gaslight. And then the two-story building that has the gable end facing us with the nice circular window, that's the engine shop. That's where the very first steam engine was put in 1853, a 60-horsepower engine. In 1937, that became the bathroom for the shovel facility. We're not sure whether there was actually a bathroom on site or whether they had privies before that. The walkways here are regular concrete supplemented by this textured concrete. So they're doing that to make things look a little more interesting. And you can see the green areas are going to be grass. Some of it is seeded, some of it's been sodded. And you're pretty much looking at the way that this is going to be landscaped. We're getting close to the end of the tour, so if you follow me, we'll head back to the railroad station. Oh, we're not there yet. Hold on. Hold the applause. There's still plenty of time for me to make a mistake.
Whereas they look at me though, will you? Our leader.
Very good. Ed.
This way. We could have talked about here, and I'm glad you came today because I think when people are living here, tours will be a lot quieter. But somebody mentioned that when they were in the service, they saw Army shovels with the Ames logo on them, and that's absolutely true. Actually, World War I and World War II added to the life of the shovel shop, because certainly by the turn of the century, this was not the most productive of the Ames Company's shops. When World War I came along, demand increased, and they puttered along for a while. The Ameses did a good thing for the town, that despite the fact that when the Depression came along, demand went down everywhere, they kept this shop open on reduced hours, but it did keep people getting at least part of a wage every week. So that was part of this strange relationship between the town. A lot of company towns talk about this paternalistic relationship between the owners and the workers. Here, I'm not sure that it was as paternalistic as you might think. I think that if you look at the Ameses, the way that they acted and the way that people acted towards them, it was more of rich people who were citizens of the town and not so rich people that were citizens of the town, and everybody felt an obligation to do something. So the Ameses gave the library, other people made much smaller donations, but I don't think the Ameses ever thought of themselves as being above the rest of the folks in town until perhaps that last generation, that fourth generation, that sort of got hooked on the idea of being English country gentlemen, and moving out to places like Stonehouse Hill and Sheep Pasture and Borderland, and maybe getting away from the active life of downtown Northeastern. But for the most part, and even continuing today, Ameses are citizens of the town. The Army shovels were made here through World War II. A number of other war-related items were made here as well. Turret rings for tanks were made here, and some smaller materials as well. But by 1952, after a period of slowly shutting down after World War II, this site stopped being an industrial site, and for 20 years it was pretty much abandoned. Then it was bought by Arnold Tophius in 1972, who turned it into warehouses. And then we went through that period when you, the people of Easton, rallied together to save this this site. And this is what you're getting. You're going to be able to walk through this place. It's open to the public. Yes, it's private, and you have to respect people's privacy. Don't knock on their door and run away. But you're invited to walk through here, and in back over here, this last area that's being taken care of is going to be a public park. They're expanding the Ames Monument section. This is going to be, don't encourage people, but it's going to be a heck of a rock climbing wall. And there's going to be the rocks here, and a retention pond that's going to be called a rain garden with some nice planting in there as well. So it's a 2.5-acre park that the town is getting, along with the wastewater treatment, and finally the right to come back to what Colleen Corona has called, I think correctly, the heart of Easton, the Ames Shovel Works. So we're going to take a walk right through here, back to the parking lot, and off to the railroad station. Thank you, guys.